Welcome to the System Simplified podcast, where we feature top leaders who share stories on how to successfully systemize a business. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hello, Adi Klevit here, the host of the System Simplified podcast, where I feature top founders, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders about systematizing a business. And today's episode is being brought to you by Business Success Consulting Group, where we create, document, optimize, and implement processes and procedures so businesses can grow and thrive. And today's guest is John Warrillow. Hi, John.
Hey, Adi, how are you?
Doing well. I'm really happy to have you here as a guest. We're going to talk all about processes and procedures and systematizing and using your very valuable software to help companies systematize. So we're going to have a great discussion here. But first of all, let me read your full bio so people know who we are talking with. So you are the author of Build to Sell, which small businesses trends recognize as best book of all times on how to run a small business. And it's true. And you are the host of Build to Sell Radio, which I actually have it. I don't have my phone with me, but it's one of the podcasts that I really like to listen to. It's actually, I wanted to show somebody my podcast, so I went to Spotify, and then it was Build to Sell just next to mine. So I definitely value that.
Piece of the pod.
Yeah, it's great. It's very good. And you're the founder of valuebuilder.com and VidGuide. And VidGuide is video guide. So it's vidguide.com, which is a software that helps owners document their SOPs. So I am excited about our conversation.
Yeah,
so
me too.
First of all, tell me a little bit more about yourself and how it came about that you wrote Build to Sell.
Yeah, I mean, it came out of a conversation I had with an M&A professional in Toronto. I'd built a company that I thought was very valuable. It was 5 or 6 million in revenue. We had 20 or 30 employees, and I went to sell it. And this guy, Perry, an M&A guy, said, "Look, I can't sell it because it's too dependent on you. It's you're doing the research, you're doing the selling, and it's really not worth anything to anybody." And it was like hearing your baby's the ugliest in the maternity ward. It was not a good feeling to be told that this thing that you created that I had slaved over for years was worthless in his mind. And so that's kind of got me thinking about how I needed to think differently. Ultimately, I transitioned that business into a recurring revenue subscription business. It was acquired by a publicly traded company, and that, along with lots of other experiences I had, led me to write this book called Built to Sell, which is about how do you create a business that can thrive without you. And germane to our conversation today is the kind of the core idea is like, how do you get your business to thrive when you're not around to do it? And that's the kind of core principles of a valuable business is one that operates when the owner is not there, which I know is like music to your ears. The work that you do in your consulting practice is like all day long. This is kind of what you do. So that's me in a nutshell.
Great. Well, our listeners are probably curious to hear your opinion and your advice. What are the actions that they should take in order for them to build a business that is independent of them?
Yeah, it starts with doing less. I think one of the temptations that entrepreneurs have is that we get myopically focused on growing revenue because that's the way we're kind of rewarded. That's the way society thinks. You show up at a cocktail party. It's not too long before two entrepreneurs are evaluating one another based on how many employees they have, right? The more employees, the more successful they are because bigger is better in their mind. The problem with that is bigger is not always more valuable. And so I would just encourage folks to think about what drives the value of your company as opposed to what drives the revenue of your company. They can be related, but they are in many cases different. I've seen lots of examples. In my own case, I thought I was building a very successful company, but it actually turned out to be less successful than I thought because it was dependent on me. So I think the first thing to do is less. The reason companies get too big and focused on revenue is because they start cross-selling. Everybody's heard about, it's 8 times easier to cross-sell an existing customer a second or third product than it is to go find more people that offer what it is that you want, whatever it is you want. The more valuable companies do one thing better than everybody else. And so they're the ones that are really, really focused on doing one thing. And that gives employees reps, like repetitions on nailing that one service or product. You start chasing revenue, you're starting to cross-sell existing services. Employees don't get enough reps. And so A, you don't have the processes to deliver, and B, the employees just don't have enough repetitions delivering the process to do it well.
Good. Give me an example of that particular principle of concentrating on one repetitive sale cycle, I guess, one repetitive product as opposed to going and cross-selling.
Stephanie Breedlove comes to mind. Stephanie was a woman who had a child. She wanted to hire a nanny. She had a bad experience trying to find one of the giant companies that offer nanny or offered to pay nannies, one of the giant payroll companies. And so what she did is set up a payroll companies just for paying nannies. So her target market were parents who have a nanny to pay. And she built this up to about 300 grand in revenue. It's just Stephanie and one employee, when it became harder and harder for her to acquire customers because she kind of exhausted her mom's group and the different places that she could easily, find customers. And she reached this fork in the road, and she went to a consultant. She went to like conferences to try to figure out what to do. And everybody was telling her to cross-sell, right? Because it's way easier to cross-sell your existing customers, right? So you think busy parents, right? What else do they need? Well, they probably need like lawn care services and like meal delivery services, all these services that were way outside of Stephanie's sweet spot. And then she got to thinking, well, what it is that she does best, which is setting up payroll for parents who had a nanny to pay. Long story short, she decided to do the harder thing, which is to stick to her knitting, focus on just doing payroll for parents who had a nanny to pay. 25 years later, her business was $9 million in revenue. So this is not Tesla. This is not Google. This is not a uber fast growth company. 25 years to 9 million in revenue. She looks around and says, who would want to buy this thing? And she looks at care.com. Care.com has 7 million subscribers. Stephanie at the time has 10,000 customers. Stephanie does the math for Care and says, look, if 1% of your 7 million subscribers buy my payroll service. By the way, Care, if you don't know, is like the Angie's List of care providers, right? You plug in your zip code and it'll give you 5-star rated babysitters in your local market. So they all need payroll services, right? So if 1% buy the payroll service, Stephanie argued, that's a company 7 times my size. Long story short, Stephanie sold her $9 million business for $54 million, 6 times revenue. Like, for those of you who are listening who would be used to hearing about multiples, usually it's a multiple of EBITDA. And you know that for a small business, and like a 6x multiple is a good multiple to get. She got that on revenue. And the reason she got it on revenue is because care.com saw her business and said, that is an efficient way for us to sell our service into that customer base. We can effectively sell that service to the 7 million people who subscribe to what we do. Had she done the easier thing, which was to go into lawn care and all sorts of other services, she would not have been attractive to care.com. And that's the problem with chasing revenues. It generally has you launch a whole bunch of services that aren't going to be valuable to an acquirer. It makes you feel good in the short term because your revenue is going up, but in the long term, it doesn't add much value to your business.
Absolutely. That is a very good point. So what are other points that you can share with our listeners on how to build value, how to create your business so it has value?
Yeah. So look, less is more, I think, as I mentioned earlier, doing one thing. The next thing is to try to get recurring revenue. So when an acquirer looks at your business, they're going to look at you as the owner, and they're going to say, okay, we're going to write this owner a big check, and we're going to try to tie that owner in on an earn out or maybe get them to roll some equity. But we know that once we write a big 6, 7, 8-figure check, that owner is going to be checked out. They're going to be on the beach. And so what we need to understand is, how is this company going to continue to grow without the owner? And recurring revenue can be one of the sort of secret sauces, so to speak, of making that case to an acquirer. So having some sort of contract revenue, service contracts, like if you're an HVAC company, it's one thing to install furnaces. That's fine. That's great. That's one-off revenue. But if you've got a recurring service model where every 6 months you go in and change out the filters and check the air quality, that's a much more valuable business, right? If you're a swimming pool installation company, well, it's great. You get like 10 grand to go install a swimming pool or 30 grand or whatever they cost. But what's more valuable in the eyes of an acquirer is like a maintenance contract with your homeowners that allows you to maintain that pool all throughout the year. And so you don't have to be a software company to create recurring revenue. You can do it in home services. You can do it in virtually any industry, but creating some form of recurring revenue is going to make your business much more valuable to an acquirer.
Absolutely. And it also applies in service, in the service industry, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, if you're sort of a one-off consulting firm and you've got no tail to your revenue, you have to kind of every month kind of go scramble around trying to figure out who's going to buy your service next month. It's not going to be very valuable. Whereas if you pick a service like search engine optimization and you say, okay, all we're going to do is manage your SEO, or all we're going to do is manage your PPC campaigns, your paid search campaigns. Like that's got recurring revenue to it, which is going to be much more valuable than kind of one-off projects where every project's different, everything's new. It's going to be really tough to sell a business like that.
Absolutely. And I've seen it also with law firms and CPAs that they are moving from, okay, pay me just twice a year or once a year when I'm doing your tax return, to a more consultative revenue. I mean, and it's recurring revenue where we will look at your books, we will look at your P&L, we'll look at your reports, see where you're at, but there is that consistency. And when you get onto a subscription, you have more of a chance to retain your existing clients.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Very good. Any other points in terms of build the business with the viewpoint to sell it?
Yeah, I mean, the third is what we refer to as hub and spoke. So hub and spoke is a business that's dependent on the owner. So when you think about a wheel, you've got the middle hub and then you've got all the spokes. And if you've ever flown through Chicago O'Hare on a snow day, you know when the hub goes down, like the transportation system basically fails. And so hub and spoke in a business analogy where you have those owners who everything comes into them, right? So customer needs a discount approved, owner approves it. Employee needs a vacation day approved, owner approves it. New product launch, owner approves. Everything is approved by the owner, and it's incredibly efficient for those owners, right? They are on top of their business. They're in founder mode, to use the Paul Graham term. Like they are dialed in right up until the moment they want to take a vacation, they get sick, they're out for a couple of days for whatever reason, and their business completely implodes. So it can be very intoxicating and addictive to be that middle of the hub and always answering questions. You feel really important. Everybody's coming to you right up until the time you're like, okay, I need a break. I want to take a couple of days off. And the whole thing kind of falls apart. So that's something that we spent a lot of time on and it goes back to, again, I know your business is very, very focused on this idea of documenting your standard operating procedures, making sure that employees can do the work when you are not there. That's going to be incredibly important to an acquirer because, again, same thing. Acquirer is going to look at your business and say, okay, great. We're going to write a big check. He or she is going to ride off into the sunset. Who's left holding the bag? Like, can these employees, the next level down, run this thing? And they're going to be like poking around it. Like, what are your standard operating procedures? How well are they documented? Like, do people know how to follow them? Et cetera. So that's another major driver of value in a company.
Absolutely. And even if the employees know how to do that, are they going to stay? I mean, that's the risk. I had a client that he hired us to come in and document their processes and procedures after he bought a new business, because the two employees that were the most valuable in the business have been there for a long time. They were in their 60s. So you never know. It doesn't mean that they are going to quit tomorrow, but you never know what will happen when they're going to retire, or if something happens to them. The entire value of that business was tied into the heads of in the knowledge of those employees. So we came and extracted the information and wrote the SOPs. So now if something happens or they decide to leave or it's not working out, it's not a problem anymore.
That's amazing. And
About
you're
it.
right. It's
Yeah, it's a
because
risk.
yeah, not only the owner, but you're right. It's the next level of managers, some of whom may have equity, so they might also get a check, and so they may not be super inclined to stick around. If it's a private equity buyer and the private equity company changes the culture of the business, that can also lead to a lot of attrition among employees. So yeah, you think about the delicate alchemy that is your company. That sort of that you use the term secret sauce, and I think it's absolutely right. This sort of cocktail of culture plus brand that is often not well documented in the mind of the owner. Another thing we haven't talked about, but I think is important, is this idea of sort of instinctive brand leadership. Oftentimes, entrepreneurs, they instinctively understand their brand and what it means in the eyes of their customers, but sometimes have a tough time articulating exactly what the brand is. And so employees don't necessarily live it the same way that the founder would. And so as long as the founder's there, overseeing, communications to customers, marketing, advertising, the brand can live on. But if that owner leaves, the soul of the brand is often kind of left compromised. And so again, that's another thing that you want to document. What is our brand? What do we stand for? What are the kind of pillars of our brand? How is it displayed in a visual way and so forth? So that's another kind of element of documenting a business that I think is important.
John, you're absolutely correct. We just had a client where we documented what we call the identity of that company. So what does it mean? What is that company? What is really the brand? It's not the colors and the logo, but what does it mean? Like, what is the identity? Which includes obviously the vision, the mission, the core values, but not just words on a paper or on the computer, but what does it really mean? And in order to do that, you really have to do a deep knowledge transfer. You have to sit there and you have to dig and ask questions and get the owner to take a look and figure out not just, oh, I just do it that way because that's who I am. Well, who are you? And what are the components that we can extract in order to document?
Yeah, absolutely. And getting the founder to articulate, the founder's story, like oftentimes there's a narrative, right? There's like in the case of Stephanie Breedlove, as an example, go back to what we were talking about earlier. Here she is. She's a new mom. She says, I'm going to pay my nanny legitimately. I'm not going to give her cash. I'm going to go through a payroll service. I call ADP. ADP gives me the runaround. I call Paychex and they kind of transfer my call 3 times. And they kind of, she threw her hands up in the air and said, this is crazy. I'm trying to pay this person legitimately and I can't get anyone to take my business. She came home that night and said, honey, what if we set up a payroll company just for parents who have a nanny to pay? That's a founder's narrative. She sold it 1,000 times. And if every employee gets indoctrinated into her company with that story, she gets it immediately without knowing what's on the paper, what the 4 values are of the company. She knows customer service is important, treating parents with respect, speed to service, making sure you get things done quickly because parents are busy. Like all those things are inherent within that story. You don't even have to say anything. You just have to tell the story.
Absolutely. And that's the way you told the story at the beginning of this podcast.
That's exactly right.
Like, this is what happened. And I tell my story. I was working for a big consulting company and I decided to start my own. And I started as a general business consultant because I'm really good at helping businesses grow, thrive. I can identify problems, solve them. And I will tell my clients, I will tell them, you need standard operating procedures. You need to document your processes because how are you going to train? How are you going to onboard? What if you want to sell? What if you lose an employee? They go, yeah, but it was like every week. Did you do it? No. Did you do it? No. So one day I said, well, how about if I do it for you? Really? Yes. Oh, okay. We got it done. And I go, oh. And then I asked the next client and I go, oh, wow, you do it for us? That's great. And we got it done. So I actually got what I wanted, which is expansion for those companies. But I knew that without processes, and John, you and I know that processes are not just the processes. That's not what's but it's the combination of everything that will make it grow. So that's how it started. I realized there is a niche and the niche is done it for you, process documentation service. And I was like, okay. And that's how it got started. And now we grew and grew and we have many clients in different industries. But that's how it starts, when you actually have that story, when you recognize a need that you can help and serve others.
So true. So true. So you've got your own founder story, which is great.
Exactly. I think we all do. I mean, if we really look at it, so our listeners
Yeah.
that are listening, what is your founder story? You have one, because there was a point in time when you did not have a business, and then there was a point in time when you had a business. Well, that bridge between the two, that's where your founder story is. And it's very important to understand that and tell it, because it conveys everything. It conveys your passion, like what you learned, what you know, why you're helping people. So
Yeah,
absolutely.
it's so well thought out. And one of the things that it goes a little bit to VidGuide, but the problem with going remote, and so many companies are either partially remote, fully remote, flex work, whatever, is the owner and founder and the keeper of that brand is no longer walking the hallways.
Mm-hmm.
Before the pandemic, you'd go in, oftentimes the owner would be there first thing. You'd say hi, and you'd kind of get the pace of the company, the culture, the norms, how you treat customers, almost by osmosis. You'd hear the founder, talking to a customer, and you'd kind of get it. Oh, okay, I need to be enthusiastic but knowledgeable, or I need to be, like serious and very, reflective. Whatever the founder does, sort of sets the tone. Everybody goes remote during the pandemic, and that sort of osmosis, that learning through observing, goes away, right? And so and now of course we're all back mostly in the office, but still people are in some cases distributed, going into the office once or twice a week, and they're just not getting the exposure. So documenting the founder's story, shooting it on a video, making it compelling, I think is important, especially in a remote work environment where you're just not learning that anymore through kind of the shoulder to shoulder osmosis, if that makes sense.
For sure, for sure. So from your experience, how important are well-documented processes and procedures in increasing the value of a company?
Yeah, they're critical. Again, it's not that the acquirer wants the processes for their own sake. What they want is a business that can thrive without the owner. And oftentimes the prerequisite for that, or the raw material for that, are standard operating procedures. So they may decide to change those standard operating procedures going forward, but what they need to know is, can this company run on day one without the founder? Because again, when that check clears, I know my clock is ticking. I know the founder's got one foot out the door. So I want to know, can this business continue to grow without the founder? And to your point, the next generation of leaders that maybe brought the founder to where they are, right? Because if they're also disrupted by the acquisition, the acquirer needs to know, well, what if they leave? And it comes down to, I often see, I do this podcast, built this already, you referenced in your introduction, which was very generous. So I interview founders about the sale of their company. And oftentimes I'll hear about founders shooting videos during the diligence process to explain how their company works. And when I pick the scab on that and I ask, why are you doing that? They tell me, imagine yourself, you're an acquirer, right? You're trying to visualize, what's it going to be like to sit in the cockpit of this airplane, this company, and start to fly the plane on day one. And so that can be very intimidating for an acquirer. Again, think about yourself. You're trained to be a pilot, and you get in the pilot's seat, you're driving the plane, you're flying the plane, hopefully, and you've got all the buttons and you don't know what any of the buttons do. And it would be very intimidating, and you'd want a lot of training. And so what a lot of owners do during due diligence is they'll actually record just a screen share of their business. Here's how we log into Google Analytics. Here's how we check payroll. Here's how we check our daily receipts. Here's how we do an AR report. And they're just shooting video, right? It's crude, but effectively it's showing the owner, the new owner, the prospective new owner, when you get in the cockpit, you can basically, here are the dials we look at to know if the plane is flying.
Right.
And it can be very compelling for an acquirer. Just gives them a sense of confidence to move forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Have you seen a difference in the evaluation of a company when they had standard operating procedures or processes and when they didn't?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that when business owners start working with us, we have them do this thing called the Value Builder Questionnaire, and it's got 8 essentially drivers of the value of their company. And when the average performing business goes in and completes the Value Builder Questionnaire, their average score, we've done it now 80,000 plus times, is 59 out of a possible 100. Those that score 80 or greater, so move their score from 59 to 80, are getting 2x the average value. So the average offer received by the business owners that do Value Builder is around 3.6 times pre-tax profit. For those who get 80 or greater, it goes to 7 times pre-tax profit. So we know that if you move your score in the Value Builder report, these 8 factors, it has a material impact on the value of your company. Of the 8 factors, hub and spoke is one of the heaviest weighted. Hub and spoke is the factor we talked about earlier, which is the company's dependence on the owner. So we know with like a high degree of confidence empirically that moving your score on hub and spoke, documenting your standing operating procedures will have an impact on the value of your company. Like we can see it empirically in the research we do.
Amazing. All right, let's talk about VidGuide now, which is vidguide.com. Again, vid for video. And that is the software that you developed in order to help owners record themselves and document the processes.
Yeah. So, I mean, effectively, it was sort of scratching our own itch. When we saw the impact standard operating procedures had on improving hub and spoke scores in Value Builder, we got a lot of inbound sort of inquiries from the big software providers that provide standard operating procedure software and saying, hey, can we partner and so forth. And so we did a bunch of demos and I looked at a bunch of the software on the market. And the overwhelming sort of observation that we had was that a lot of the standard operating procedure software is designed for people who think in systems. They think linearly. They think step 1, step 2, step 3. And so it works really well for systems thinkers. The challenge is that most founders are not systems thinkers. And I know this because I used to be part of something called the Strategic Coach. Do you know a Strategic Coach, Addie?
Absolutely.
So Strategic Coach, Dan Sullivan, based in Toronto. I had Dan as a coach. This goes back probably 10 years now. So he had us all do our Kolbe. Are you familiar with the Kolbe personality test?
Yes.
Kolbe rates you on these 4 attributes. 2 that are important here. One of them is called follow through.
Yeah.
What's that?
Probably the quick start.
Yeah, quick start and follow through. So he had us kind of all do, there's about 60 entrepreneurs in the room. He had us all do our Kolbe. And he said, out of interest, does anybody have a high score, which he determined is 7 or greater out of 10 on follow through? And like nobody's hands went in the air. And they said, okay, put your hands down. How about quick start? Did anybody score like 7 or greater on quick start? And literally 60 hands went in the air. And so what you need to know about that is that quick start are people who are the people in the room that are great in a brainstorming room. They've got lots of good ideas. They think very laterally about a problem. So they're not very linear in the way they solve problems. They think horizontally. They think about ideas that worked in different industries and different times in their life. They're not very linear. Follow through is the inclination to create systems from process. And virtually no entrepreneur is high on follow through and high on quick start on the same time. They're like virtually like oil and water. They don't mix. And so when you have an entrepreneur that's high on quick start, they're not going to be inclined to create a standard operating procedure. It's just going to be like allergic. They won't even.
It's like the story I told. That's what I found. I mean, I absolutely
Exactly
agree with you because that's nothing happened. And then I said, hey, can I do it for you? Yes, please. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly right, Addie. It's like they know intellectually that they should do it. It's like brushing your teeth. I know I should do it, but I forgot, or eating well or whatever. It's so fascinating. They know that they should do it, but they don't do it. So the idea behind VidGuide is instead of creating standard operating procedures, you simply share your computer screen as you do it the way you would do it. So if there's a way you like to collect a receivable or run an AR report or pull a report out of Salesforce or whatever it is that you do, you simply record a video and you send it to your employees. Your employees then tag it as part of a department, and then it builds up a knowledge base in that department. So when you have a new employee start, you give them all the videos associated with accounting or all the videos associated with marketing. And so it's kind of the anti-standard operating procedure software in a way. It's really standard operating procedure designed for founders who don't have the time, inclination, or wherewithal to create standard operating procedures. So that's what VidGuide is.
Makes total sense. Well, it's better to document something than nothing. And that's what you took. You just observed and saw that that's the best way for them to operate. And that is what they decide to do, which is great and definitely needed. Absolutely. Well, John, this has been a great conversation. So if people want to know more about Build to Sell, I mean, obviously they can go to the podcast, which is on all platforms. They can go to Amazon and buy your book, but any other places you would like to direct them to go?
Yeah, just vidguide.com. If you're interested, you can check it out, get a free trial, vidguide.com.
Excellent. And we'll definitely add all of those resources to the show notes so it be easily found. Well, thank you so much for being a guest on this podcast. It's been a great conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners did as well.
Thanks, Addie. It was fun to be with you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the System Simplified podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.